Everyone in the city knew Michael and Helen had been promised to each other since they were kids, and they were set to get engaged right after their college entrance exams. Growing up, Helen had always doted on Michael, putting him first in everything. Everyone envied Michael for having a fiancée who was like a protective older sister. But things took a turn their senior year when Helen's family fell on hard times. Michael's parents didn't want him marrying into a fallen family and pressured Helen to break off the engagement. Even after they beat her until she coughed up blood, Helen refused. "Mr. and Mrs. Kane, I swear I'll rebuild my family's fortune and give Michael a better life." Before his parents could respond, Michael broke free from the house staff holding him back and announced in front of everyone that he would marry Helen or no one. With things having come to this, his family had no choice but to back down. After 17 years, Helen had become the love of Michael's life, someone he could never let go, until a transfer student arrived 3 months before the exams. The new kid had dark skin and would just fidget with the hem of his shirt whenever he got nervous. That was the first time Helen ever asked Michael for a favor. "Michael, Paul is a boy from a poor family I used to sponsor. Could you register him at your condo's address for the school district? The college exams are so much harder where he's from." I promised him I'd help, but with my family's situation now, Helen gave a bitter, embarrassed smile. "Can you help him take the exams here in the city?" Without a second thought, Michael did everything she asked. As for the country boy, Michael, who came from a prominent family and excelled at everything, never gave him a second thought. Until a month later, when Michael was getting water and overheard his classmates whispering in a bathroom stall. "That country boy has some serious game. It's only been a few days, and he's already got Helen wrapped around his finger. You don't think that was them kissing in the woods behind the field after study hall the other night, do you? Probably. But the exams are just 2 months away. If Helen's getting into a relationship now, how is she going to focus on studying? If she bombs, she still has Michael. What do you know?" Michael stood frozen in the empty bathroom. The water cup in his hand crashed to the floor, and the scalding water burned his young, tender skin, leaving an ugly red mark. He tried to break up with Helen, but the normally cool and proud girl knelt before him. "Michael, we've been together for so many years. How could you think that of me? Paul just transferred here from the countryside. Everyone shuns him. I'm the only one he feels comfortable asking for help. If you don't like it, I'll stay away from him from now on." Michael's shoulders trembled. He wanted to believe it was all just baseless gossip, that he was just being too sensitive. But half a month before the exams, a group of guys cornered Paul at the school gate after evening study hall. "Your dad owes us money, so we're taking you as payment. You think you can hide from us by running to the city? We can find you anywhere. Boys, grab him." Paul cried and screamed after getting slapped twice, yelling Helen's name. Michael's face paled. Before he could react, he saw Helen rush forward without a moment's hesitation. A thug held a knife to Paul's face. "His dad owes us $1 million. Pay up if you want him back. Otherwise, I'll carve up this pretty boy's face for good." Helen stopped in her tracks. She couldn't possibly come up with $1 million right now. She turned to Michael, her face pleading. "Michael, can you go with them in Paul's place for now? I'll go to your family for help immediately. Paul's not like you. He's just a little boy, he hasn't seen the world. He's too scared." Michael felt like he'd been struck by lightning. The girl in front of him, who used to cry if he so much as got a paper cut, was now asking him to be a hostage in Paul's place. The sharpened blade gleamed, and the thug's eyes were cold and menacing. This wasn't a joke, this was a life or death trade. Michael asked numbly, "What if I don't go?" Helen looked like she was about to lose her mind. "Michael, can't you just be a little kinder?" The kidnapper let out a cruel laugh, and a 2-inch gash appeared on Paul's pale cheek. Bright red blood instantly gushed out. Helen couldn't take it anymore. She shoved Michael forward. As Paul threw himself into Helen's arms like a frightened bird, a sharp blade, appearing from nowhere, pierced through Michael's palm. Michael woke up in the hospital. Helen was by his bedside, not having left for a moment. When she saw him wake up, her face lit up. "Michael, you're finally awake." Michael thought she was happy he'd woken up safely, but her next words made his already pale face turn even paler. Now Paul can finally stop worrying. You have no idea how much he's been crying. Before Michael could speak, a sharp, throbbing pain shot through his right hand. He looked down in horror. He threw back the covers to see his writing hand wrapped up like a mummy. What happened to my hand? Helen guiltily looked away. The doctor said it's fine, just an injury. With proper rehab, there won't be any long-term effects. You just need to rest it for a while. Michael's heart sank. He asked, his words slow and heavy. Rest it for how long? Helen's breath hitched. She looked down, hesitating for a long moment before finally saying, 2 months. But the college entrance exams were in less than 2 weeks. Despair washed over Michael. In that instant, his world turned upside down, and all he could hear was a long, empty ringing in his ears. Getting into Harvard had been Michael's dream since he was a child. Even though he was the heir to the prestigious Kane family, he had never given up on that dream. He had worked tirelessly for years to achieve it, pouring in just as much effort as anyone else. Helen, who had grown up with him, had seen it all, his passion, his hopes, his desire. She knew everything. But now, she was telling him that he would have to miss the battle he had anticipated and prepared for so long, all for such an absurd reason. Michael gritted his teeth, his eyes turning red. Before he could explode, a figure stumbled into the room and fell to his knees in front of Michael with a loud thud. It's my fault. It's all my fault. If my family wasn't so poor and didn't get into trouble, none of this would have happened. It's my fault I wasn't born rich. I've dragged you down, Mr. Kane. It's all my fault. Paul banged his head on the floor. Helen, her heart aching, rushed to pull him up. Paul, how could this be your fault? It's your family's fault. It has nothing to do with you. Michael won't blame you. Paul, please stop crying. It was as if Paul were the one who was seriously injured and couldn't take the exams, not Michael. Sitting on the bed, Michael found the whole scene laughable. His right hand was this badly injured. If it wasn't Paul's fault, was it his own? And what right did Helen have to forgive Paul on his behalf? Michael spoke coldly. If it's not his fault, then is it mine? At his words, Paul buried his face in Helen's arms and began to sob hysterically, repeating over and over, I'm sorry. It's all my fault. I wasn't born rich. Helen looked at Michael. Her eyes filled with disapproval. Michael, why do you have to push him like this? The Kane family is so wealthy. Taking a gap year and retaking the exams is no big deal for you. Paul isn't like you. He has nothing. Why can't you just be a little kinder, a little more forgiving? Michael could hardly believe his ears. The words gap year fell so lightly from Helen's lips, yet they crushed his heart like a mountain, shattering it into a million pieces. Paul, still sobbing in Helen's embrace, finally stopped crying. Thank you, Helen. Hearing Paul's hoarse voice, Helen went out to get him some water. For a moment, only Michael and Paul were left in the room. Paul carefully studied the young master of the Kane family lying in the bed. Even with such a severe injury, he received the best treatment and care immediately. Despite the blood loss, he still looked like a pampered young master, not a pathetic patient. Paul clenched his fists, suppressing the jealousy in his heart. He lowered his eyes and was about to kneel again. Mr. Kane, it's all my fault. Please don't be mad at Helen. You can stop. Helen isn't here. You don't have to act so pathetic. Michael was in no mood to play along. Were those guys really collecting a debt for your family? Was my hand getting injured really just a coincidence? Paul, you know exactly what kind of disgusting thoughts you're hiding. If you want a piece of trash like Helen, take her. I don't care. Paul lowered his head. Thank you, Mr. Kane. Helen is all I have. As soon as I get into college, I'll disappear from your life with her. Michael didn't want to hear any more. He kicked him out of the room and went straight home. His father was shocked to see him in such a state. After learning what happened, he was furious. I told you her family was no good. The moment they lost their fortune, their true colors started to show. Do you think I'm some snob who only cares about money? Michael, I just don't want to see you get hurt. If her family weren't such devious people, I wouldn't care if you married her. Michael's eyes were red. He shook his head numbly. He had been too foolish, too naive. He had put too much faith in the pure love of his youth. "Dad, I'm going to America the day before the exams." An offer letter from a professor who had strongly encouraged him to study abroad was still sitting in his inbox. At the time, Michael had been so focused on Harvard that he had turned down all the overseas universities without a second thought. His father, however, had been very supportive of him studying abroad and had been quite disappointed. His father was moved, but his heart ached for his son. "Okay, Dad understands. Also, that household registration I transferred to the condo for the school district. Have it transferred out." Michael looked at the calendar on the wall. 10 days until the exams. In 10 days, he would be free from this nightmare. The day after Michael came home to recover, Helen showed up. She was holding a souffle from the shop near their middle school, the one Michael used to love. It was a hot June in the city. The slender girl was covered in sweat, carefully protecting the souffle in her arms. Her eyes were as bright as the sun, just like before. For a moment, Michael was lost in a daze, but the sharp pain from his right hand brought him back, and his heart filled with a dense ache of sorrow and hatred. Things were different now. The Helen before him was no longer the Helen from his memories, but a stranger whose world revolved around Paul. "Michael, I waited in line for so long to get this. You loved this back in middle school. Come on, eat it. A little something sweet will make you feel better." Helen's eyes looked wet, filled with a desperate plea as she pushed the souffle towards Michael. Michael sneered internally. "Feeling better will make me forgive what you and Paul did to me?" Michael managed to open the box and then casually set it aside. Helen asked nervously, "Michael, you don't want to eat it?" "The cream has all melted," Michael said flatly. "Throw it out." The cream on the souffle had melted into a sticky liquid during her journey, no longer resembling its original form. Just like them. Helen looked sad for a moment, then forced a smile. "It's okay. Next time we'll go together and eat it fresh." She quickly changed the subject, saying the car to take Michael to his tutoring session was already waiting at the gate. "What tutoring?"
I'm sorry, Michael.
"I know this has hurt you deeply and kept you from achieving your dream, so I found a really famous tutor in the city to give us private lessons. It should give you a better shot at Harvard." The apology and sincerity in Helen's eyes seemed genuine. She took Michael's uninjured left hand and started walking towards the door. "Michael, I'm really sorry. I didn't know this would happen. I don't know how to earn your forgiveness, so this is the only way I could think of to make it up to you." Michael let her lead him, suppressing the faint ripple of emotion her words stirred in him. His heart felt numb. But when Helen opened the front passenger door for him instead of the back, a bad feeling washed over him. Sure enough, as soon as the door opened, Michael saw Paul cowering in the back seat. "Mr. Kane, it was me. I kept telling Helen I wanted to go to class with her. My fundamentals are too weak." Before Michael could say anything, Helen quickly jumped in to defend Paul. "Michael, Paul's not like us. His only way to a better life is to get into a good college. You have no idea how anxious he's been about you getting hurt. He hasn't been able to focus on his studies at all lately. If Paul doesn't get into a good college, his life is basically over." Her words implied that if Michael didn't agree to let Paul come along, he would be the villain who ruined Paul's life. Paul wouldn't be ruined by missing one tutoring session, but Michael's dream of getting into Harvard this year had been completely shattered because of him. Michael managed a twitch of his lips and said coldly, "Whatever." His coldness made Helen's heart skip a beat. She watched Michael's indifferent face in the rearview mirror, an indescribable unease creeping into her heart. Paul noticed Helen's expression and gently poked her. "Helen, I'm feeling a little carsick." Helen frowned. "Just hang in there." Her mind was entirely consumed by Michael's emotionless words from moments ago. Paul was stunned. Ever since he had transferred to the city, Helen had been incredibly protective of him. Short of following him into the men's restroom, she handled everything for him. Whenever he had a problem, she would solve it immediately. This was the first time she had ignored his plea for help. The car drove on in silence. When they arrived, Helen got out first and opened the door for Paul. Michael paused. In all the years he had known Helen, This was the first time she hadn't opened the car door for him. After helping Paul out, Helen realized her mistake and hurried back to the front, only to find that Michael had already gotten out himself. Paul has never been in such a nice car before. I was afraid he wouldn't know how to open the door. Paul lowered his head in embarrassment. Michael just waved his hand dismissively. It's fine. It was just another small detail that showed him how far Helen had strayed. But as Michael stood up straight, he realized the place looked familiar. It turned out that today's tutor was Mr. Chun, the very mentor who had encouraged him to study in the US and with whom he had worked on many projects. Michael felt the cracks reopening in his already frozen heart. Sorry, and wants to do everything to make it up to me, so she found a top-tier tutor? Was this tutor really for me? Or was she just using my name to get a tutor for Paul? It must have been a lot of work for Helen to come up with such a noble-sounding excuse. Mr. Chen warmly invited Michael inside. I was so thrilled to hear you wanted some extra help. You've always been such a diligent and brilliant kid. Though, I still think a university in the States would be a better fit for you, Michael. What happened to your hand? Michael gave a bitter smile. Just a little accident, sir. Let's talk inside. Mr. Chun led Michael directly into his private study, leaving Helen and Paul in the living room. He never really cared about the other two anyway. As a young, nationally recognized top-tier teacher, he wouldn't have agreed to tutor a couple of high school kids if it weren't for Helen, his favorite student's childhood sweetheart, saying she wanted to bring Michael over. After hearing Michael's story, Mr. Chun was furious. He paced around the study, fuming, and when he came out, his expression was cold. Helen immediately stood up. Mr. Chun, when can we start the lesson? Lesson? Mr. Chun didn't mince his words. I only agreed to let you bring your so-called friend to sit in because you said Michael wanted to come for tutoring. But with his hand injured like this, what's the point of a lesson? He should go home and rest. Helen panicked. She had indeed sought out Mr. Chun because Paul had begged her to. As the exams got closer, Paul grew more and more anxious. Ever since he found out Michael had a mentor like Mr. Chun, he had been dropping hints constantly. With a top-tier teacher like Mr. Chun to guide him, Paul's confidence would surely improve. Thinking of her relationship with Michael, Helen had confidently promised Paul she would make it happen and had tricked him into coming to Mr. Chen's house. Mr. Chun had been so enthusiastic at first. Why the sudden change of heart? She remembered Michael going into the study to speak with Mr. Chun alone, and then saw Paul's tearful, pitiful expression. A vein throbbed in Helen's temple. Michael, can't you tolerate Paul's presence at all? Are you going to cut off his chance to learn too? It wasn't Paul's fault your hand got hurt. Why do you have to target him at every turn? You and Mr. Chun are so close. Tutoring Paul wouldn't take much effort. Why can't you just be a little more generous and give him a chance? Everyone was stunned by Helen's self-righteous outburst. Michael let out a cold laugh. Helen, who does Paul think he is? He's not worth my time. Helen became anxious. Michael, whether Mr. Chun tutors him or not has nothing to do with me. If you can't deliver on your promises, don't stand here pretending to be a big shot, using my name to show off. Seeing that Michael was truly angry, Helen felt as if a bucket of ice water had been dumped over her head. Michael, don't be angry. I was just worried and spoke without thinking. It's my fault. Paul also spoke up timidly. Mr. Kane, please don't be mad at Helen. She just wants me to improve a little. It's all because I'm useless. It's all my fault. Michael just gave Helen a cold look, then turned and walked away. Helen gritted her teeth and followed him out. Paul stood there, biting his lip in frustration, but he had no choice but to hurry after them. When Helen got outside, she found that Michael had already hailed a cab and driven off. The exhaust fumes blew in her face. She stood under the scorching sun, a growing sense of confusion and unease she couldn't suppress. Why has Michael been acting so strange lately? Paul caught up to her. Helen, don't blame Mr. Kane. He's probably just in a bad mood because of his hand. It was my fault, anyway. Hearing this, Helen managed to push down the strange feelings inside her. Michael loves me more than anything. He's just being cold because he's upset about his injury. There were still 7 days until the exams. After the exams, I'll put in some extra effort. Michael will forgive me. He has to. Michael had already told Mr. Chun that he accepted the offer to study in the US. When he got home, he started packing and preparing his documents. His school records were still at the high school, so he decided to go pick them up himself. But as soon as he walked through the school gates, he felt the piercing stares of his classmates. Why was everyone looking at him so strangely? He even overheard whispers behind him, things like promiscuous, rich people play dirty, and must be nice to be rich, you can just skip the exams if you want. Confused, Michael went straight to the class president to fill out the form to retrieve his records. The class president hesitated for a long time before stammering. Michael, how's your hand? It's such a shame you can't take the exams this year, your grades are so good. You should stay away from those bad influences from now on. Michael paused, surprised. He looked at the class president. What are you talking about? Everyone at school is saying it's because you were being… The class president swallowed the ugly word promiscuous. That you were messing around with some shady people outside of school, playing with their feelings, and that's why they messed up your hand. That was the cleaned-up version of the rumor. With the exams just around the corner, the students were all stressed out. Any little bit of gossip was enough to get them excited, especially a scandal involving the campus heartthrob, Michael. Some said Michael was out clubbing and partying, and he had provoked some people from the wrong side of the tracks who came to extort him. Others said he was dating a gangster and tried to dump them before the exams. So the gangster came looking for revenge. There were even uglier rumors, saying he was a slut who had a long list of jilted lovers. Michael's long-standing image as a cool, aloof Prince Charming was completely shattered. The whole school was buzzing, and some girls were even making lewd jokes about him. How much do you think Michael charges for a night? Maybe we can hire him for some fun after the exams. The class president was so embarrassed he could barely speak, his face turning bright red. Michael's face was pale. Thanks for telling me. But do you know where these rumors started? The class president stammered, I think it came from Helen and Paul. It was because everyone knew Helen and Michael were childhood sweethearts and fiancés that her words seemed so credible. Michael stormed to the classroom next door and called Helen out into the hallway. The entire senior class on that floor craned their necks to watch. Helen, what's with the rumors going around school? What do you mean I was messing around with shady people and that's why my hand is injured and I can't take the exams? Helen anxiously tried to cover Michael's mouth and pull him to a quieter spot, pleading in a low voice, Michael, there's a reason for all of this. I have my reasons. Can we please find a quiet place to talk? There are too many people here. Michael slapped her hand away. We're talking right here. Michael's gaze was colder than ever. Helen, when you were spreading those rumors and ruining my reputation, did you think there were too many people then? What's the deal with all this garbage? You're going to explain it to me. Right now, Helen felt 1,000 eyes on her. The various stares made her feel utterly humiliated, and her face flushed red. A lot of people saw those thugs come for Paul at the school gate. He's already an outcast at school, and if those rumors spread, he wouldn't be able to show his face here. So I had to make up another excuse to cover for him. You're taking a gap year anyway. You might not even be at this school next year, and no one will know you, so I thought. Michael's eyes reddened, and he clenched his fists. He had never imagined that the girl who once had eyes only for him would be capable of sacrificing him in such a malicious way just to protect Paul. So you thought you'd just pin everything on me? That my hand got injured because I was being reckless? That it had nothing to do with Paul's family debt and the trouble he brought to our door? Is that it? I'm already so injured because of Paul that I can't even take the exams. And now you want to ruin my reputation to protect him? Helen, what do you take me for? How could you be so shameless? Her words sent shockwaves through the crowd. The entire senior floor erupted in an uproar. Michael, his eyes red with fury, grabbed his school records and strode away, ignoring Helen as she chased after him. He got into a car under the protection of his bodyguards and sped off. As soon as he was in the car, a bodyguard handed him a file. Mr. Kane, the cancellation of the school district registration you requested has been completed. The associated school enrollment spot has also been canceled. As the homeowner, Mr. Paul will not be notified of the cancellation without your consent. Michael let out a cold laugh, tossed the file on the floor, and took a deep, angry breath. With only 7 days left, the now struggling Helen had no way of finding a new registration for Paul. Michael clutched his chest, curling up in the back seat, suffocating from the pain. They take advantage of me and then stab me in the back? The world doesn't work that way. Since he couldn't take the exams because of Paul, then Paul wouldn't be taking them either. An eye for an eye. It was only fair. His phone screen kept lighting up with messages from Helen. Michael opened it to see a flood of "I'm sorry. Michael, just wait for me a little longer. After the exams, this will all be over. I won't care what happens to Paul anymore, he can walk his own path. Just this once. Can you forgive me, Michael? I really had no other choice. I had my reasons. I'll make it up to you after the exams. I'll go wherever you want. I can even retake the year with you if you want. I'll do anything for you. Michael, you're the most important person to me." Michael gave a self-mocking laugh, his eyes still red. He tossed the phone aside, not wanting to reply with a single word. After the exams? Too bad for them. There is no after. The exams were in 4 days. In all this time, he hadn't been to school, yet Helen had never once asked what he was doing or if he was upset about missing the exams. So she also hadn't noticed that his school records were gone, that his name had quietly disappeared from all the pre-exam registration materials, and that even the teachers had tacitly stopped mentioning him. For the next 2 days, Helen relentlessly sent Michael messages, but he met them with silence, even setting her notifications to silent, until 2 days before the exams, when Helen messaged him saying the school had returned the time capsules everyone had buried during their freshman year. Michael stared at his phone, thinking back to his 15-year-old self. Back then, Helen's family hadn't fallen on hard times, and he and Helen hadn't confessed their feelings for each other yet. Everything was innocent and beautiful, the best time of his life. They were inseparable. Helen spoiled him rotten, agreeing to everything from taking silly photo booth pictures to trying out trendy but terrible restaurants without a complaint. At the beginning of freshman year, the school gave each student a small metal box to put things in for their future selves. Michael had carefully written down his wish. "I like Helen. After graduation, I have to confess to Helen after the exams." It was followed by 3 bold exclamation marks, full of the tender and sweet feelings of a young boy. Michael ran to ask Helen what she wrote, but she just smiled mysteriously and said, "It's a secret. You'll find out in 3 years. What college do you want to go to? I still want to be in school with you." Helen answered casually, "I probably can't get into Harvard, but other top schools nearby are possibilities. That way it'll be easy for me to take care of you." Her expression was full of the confident certainty of a young girl. "Anyway, I'm definitely not leaving you alone. Wherever you are, that's where I'll be." Michael's face turned bright red, and he ran off with a lame excuse. His heart had pounded like a drum back then, a feeling he still remembered vividly. But thinking of the stranger Helen had become, his chest filled with an endless pain and bitterness. This was the first time in 2 days Michael replied to Helen's message. "Just hold on to it for me." Helen replied instantly, "Okay, I'll bring it to you after the exams. We promised to open our time capsules together." I remember. Michael's vision blurred. The pain in his heart was so intense he could barely breathe. He curled up in his room, sobbing silently. Through his blurry eyes, he saw another message from Helen. "By the way, Michael, do you think you could find some time to highlight the key topics in math for Paul? Your fundamentals are so strong, and math is his weak subject. I'm a little worried." In that instant, the chasm between his memories and reality sent his heart plummeting into a frozen abyss, chilling him to the bone. "Why?" Helen replied quickly. "You're not taking the exams this year, so you don't have much to do. Your schedule is pretty open, right? You could just highlight the key points for Paul. It's just a small favor. Please, Michael? We're so close. Just help me with this one thing." Michael let out a cold, red-eyed laugh. A small favor? Helen was certainly generous with other people's kindness. Why should he help the very person who ruined his chance to take the exams? Michael slammed his thumb on the keyboard. "No. Is it because of your hand? Then could you ask Mr. Chun if he has any practice problems? You're not using that stuff anyway, so you might as well put it to good use. That suffocating feeling washed over him again, and Michael's whole body began to shake. He smashed his phone against the wall. After a loud crack, the screen shattered into a spiderweb and wouldn't turn on again. Michael shot up and threw everything in his room that reminded him of Helen into the trash. The childish but treasured photo booth pictures, the birthday gifts whose wrapping he had saved every year, the labels from every milk tea she had ever bought him, and all the movie ticket stubs, all of it went into the trash. Michael found his backup phone and deleted every social media post related to Helen, changing his profile picture and background to solid black. Then, without hesitation, he blocked her. Tomorrow was the day he left for America, the day he would finally escape this nightmare. There was a knock on the door. It was his father's assistant. "Young master, here is the information you asked me to look into." Michael's face was cold as he flipped through the documents. Then he threw them on the floor, and the thick stack of papers scattered everywhere. He knew it. He knew those guys showing up was too much of a coincidence, especially right before the exams when Paul had been at the school for months. He knew there was a reason Helen treated Paul so differently. So, that's what it was. The exams were the day after tomorrow, and Paul was a nervous wreck. Even though he was registered in the city school district, where the exams were easier, he couldn't stop worrying. He twisted his fingers, anxiously waiting for Helen to ask Michael about the study guide, only to see her expression grow darker and darker. "Helen, what's wrong?" Helen let out a deep breath, looking agitated. Michael had flatly refused her and was no longer replying to her messages. Then he had blocked her completely. The unease in Helen's heart grew stronger. She forced a smile for Paul. "Michael, it's not convenient for him." Paul looked hurt. "Mr. Kane isn't even willing to do a small favor like that?" Back home, during harvest season, families with strong young men would help out families with only the old and sick. Paul's words stung Helen, but she still gently chided him. "All right, it's not his responsibility. His hand is injured, and he's already in a bad mood. It was my fault for bringing up the exams and rubbing salt in his wound." Paul lowered his head in disappointment, his eyes filled with hidden resentment. Why does Michael get to have everything? Even Helen is still on his side. He can't even take the exams this year. What's a guy who has to repeat a year got to be so proud of? Why is Helen still so hung up on him? Paul twirled a strand of his hair and bit his lip, staring at Helen until her heart softened. Okay, I'm not blaming you, it's just..." Helen ran a hand through her hair, looking completely on edge. She just felt that Michael had been acting stranger and stranger lately. His attitude towards her had become increasingly cold, and he had flatly refused her request. That had never happened before. Before Helen could dwell on it, the teacher walked into the classroom with a manila envelope. "Everyone quiet down. I'm handing out the exam admission tickets. Your admission ticket is extremely important. You only get one, so keep it safe and don't lose it. Understood? I'll call you up one by one to get your tickets. No picking them up for others. When I call your name, come to the front." Paul looked at the stack of tickets in the teacher's hand, his eyes filled with hope. Born into poverty, his only way out was through education. In the toughest states for college admissions, with their limited educational resources and the hellish difficulty of the exams, his dreams of making something of himself had all but died. But then fate intervened. Helen, who was sponsoring poor boys in the mountains, was willing to support his continued education. He was overjoyed. Every week, he would walk 2 hours on a mountain road to the town post office to mail letters to Helen, describing his admiration for the city and his gratitude towards her. This earned him Helen's favor, and she even promised to let him come to the city to study. When Paul learned that Helen's family had fallen on hard times, he was stunned. The taste of a shattered dream was like being struck by lightning. But to his surprise, even though her family was down, Helen had an incredibly powerful fiancé who, with a snap of his fingers, had his school registration and residency transferred to the city. But with his surprise came a deep, churning jealousy. When he arrived in the city, Michael had only given him a single, dismissive glance, as if he were just a piece of invisible air. But Helen, the girl who had been so warm and kind to him, the one who had filled his young heart with hope, treated Michael with what could only be described as devotion. It was a look that said Michael was the only person in the world who mattered. Paul constantly compared himself to Michael, his gaze sweeping over Michael's simple yet outrageously expensive clothes and accessories. Paul believed the only difference between them was that Michael had been born into the right family. What did Michael have that he didn't? Why did Michael have everything, while he was destined to be a good-for-nothing country bumpkin? But things were different now. He was about to take the city's college entrance exams, while Michael had a crippled hand and had to repeat a year. Paul had seen the students who repeated a year back in his village school. The immense mental pressure made them walk around in a daze every day. Not a single one of them did better the second time around. A sense of smug satisfaction filled Paul's heart. But what Paul didn't know was that for truly exceptional people, college entrance exams were far from the only path to success. Paul watched eagerly as the teacher called out name after name. But even after the names of students who were absent that day were called, Paul still hadn't heard his own. Seeing the teacher about to close the envelope and leave, Paul couldn't hold back any longer. He rushed to the front of the class and shouted, "Teacher, I don't have an admission ticket." The teacher was surprised. "Paul, you're a transfer student. According to the rules, you should be taking the exams back in your hometown." Before the teacher could finish, Paul cut him off with a frantic shout. "That's impossible. My residency has been moved to the city. I'm supposed to take the exams here. How can I not have a ticket?" The teacher, taken aback, frowned and went to the office to look into it for him. But the result was completely unexpected. His residency was no longer in the city. He couldn't take this year's city exams. Even worse, because the paperwork to transfer his residency back home hadn't been processed in time, he couldn't take the exams at all this year. Paul grabbed his hair and squatted on the floor, sobbing in despair. Helen had followed him and heard everything. Her face was grim. How could this be possible? Michael had already taken care of everything. She had seen Paul's residency get added with her own eyes. Helen thought of the worst-case scenario. Her hand shaking, she called home. A moment later, she hung up, standing frozen in place. The records showed that 7 days ago, the residency registration for the condo had been canceled. Paul's residency was now in limbo, not registered anywhere. He couldn't take the exams this year. "Paul, don't cry, don't cry. The Kane family is so powerful. Michael will definitely be able to fix this." Her own family was a shadow of its former self and couldn't solve Paul's residency problem in such a short time. But Helen believed Michael could. Paul stopped crying, all his hope now focused on Helen's phone. Helen called Michael, only to find that all her contact methods had been blocked. She stood there, stunned, her hands dropping limply to her sides. The intense feeling of unease that had been brewing in her heart finally boiled over, plunging her into a living hell. Helen gritted her teeth and, not giving up, called Michael's father. "Michael isn't like this. He loves me more than anyone. He wouldn't just leave me hanging." Helen waited with desperate hope for the call to connect. At that very moment, Michael's father was seeing him off at a private jet. The strong wind whipped across Michael's face, which was a mask of indifference. His father's phone suddenly rang. The name Helen was displayed on the screen. Michael let out a cold smile. So they finally found out. Michael reached out a slender finger and ended the call, then swiftly added her to the block list. "Dad, after I go abroad, cut off all the support the Kane family has been giving her family." His father snorted. "Of course. If it weren't for us, her family would have been finished long ago. They wouldn't have been able to cling on for this long." The Kane family's support for Helen's family was all because of Michael. But now that Helen had hurt Michael so badly, there was no way his father would continue to help them. Michael gave a faint smile and turned to board the plane. He turned off his phone, cutting himself off from the world like an isolated island. The massive plane took off. What Helen did with her life, how many poor male students she decided to help, none of it was Michael's problem anymore. From this day forward, Michael and Helen's lives were completely severed, with no possibility of ever crossing again. Helen watched as the call was disconnected. When she tried to call again, all she heard was a busy signal. Michael's father had blocked her. She borrowed a teacher's phone and tried to contact Michael through their mutual friends, but the result was the same. Michael's phone was off, and his social media accounts were all wiped clean. He was completely unreachable. A close mutual friend even sent Helen a screenshot of Michael's social media page. The pinned posts, which used to be all about her, were now gone. The page was empty. The friend sounded worried. "Did you and Michael have a fight?" "Helen, Michael stuck by you through your toughest times. He's not a bad-tempered guy. If he's acting a little childish, just be patient with him. It's not a big deal." Helen couldn't be bothered with her friend's questions and numbly hung up. She was certain now. Michael was the one who had canceled the registration. Only he had the power to do something like that a week before the exams. Paul's sobbing hadn't stopped. Helen's face was numb, her mind adrift in the clouds, her feet feeling like she was walking on cotton, completely ungrounded. Paul's eyes were swollen like peaches. "Helen, what's going on?" Helen felt like her throat was clogged with glue. It took all her strength to force the words out. It was Michael. Paul stumbled back in disbelief, then let out a piercing scream. How could Michael be so evil? Why is he so evil? His eyes were bloodshot, completely shattered by despair. The pain of not being able to take the exams made him lose all composure. He staggered around the office like a drunk. "Why won't he let me take the exams? He has everything. Why can't he leave me this one little chance to survive? It's because he can't take the exams himself, so he's not letting me take them either. That vicious man. That bastard. Shameless." Paul grabbed Helen's arm, screaming, "Helen, I have to take the exams. I can't go back to my hometown to take them. If I go back, my life will be ruined. Helen, you promised you'd help me take the exams here. You can't just abandon me. Think of something. You have to have a way." Helen was so violently shaken by the frantic Paul that she felt like she was going to be sick. The nausea rose in her throat, and her mind was filled with disbelief and despair. Michael was really that ruthless. He had planned everything in secret, just to catch her completely off guard. Michael was truly angry. It wasn't just her imagination. Helen called her family, hoping they could find a place to register Paul's residency today, but her father just yelled at her. "Helen, do you have nothing better to do? When our family was doing well, I didn't care how many charity projects you took on. But don't you see the state our family is in now? We don't have the time or energy to deal with some country boy you used to sponsor. Instead of worrying about other boys, you should be focusing on Michael. Don't you realize our entire family depends on the Canes to survive? Are you trying to kill us all?" Her father's harsh words shot through the phone, mercilessly grinding her face into the dirt, leaving her feeling utterly humiliated. He should be grateful for the help he received, but instead, he has the audacity to try and take the exams here. And you're still associating with a conniving country boy like that. Do you think transferring to a school in the city is a simple matter? Helen, stop being a fool. The exams are tomorrow, and you're still wasting your time on someone else's problems. The entire family is counting on you now. If you don't get into a good university and revive our family's fortunes, we're really finished. Her father's voice was loud, and snippets of the conversation drifted out of the receiver, reaching the ears of Paul and all the teachers present. The teachers' gazes, though restrained by their professional decorum, made Paul's face flush a deep red, making him look even more rustic. "So what if I want to take the exams here?" Helen promised him. Why couldn't she follow through? These rich kids from the city were born with silver spoons in their mouths. The crumbs that fell from their fingers would be enough for him to live on for a lifetime. Since that was the case, what was the big deal about giving him a hand? The effort it took to get him into a school here was less than what they'd spend on a single handbag. Paul bit his lip hard in frustration, his fists clenched at his sides, his eyes bloodshot. He didn't know when he had bitten his lip, but the taste of blood filled his mouth, a mixture of rage and humiliation. He was resentful. He was so damn resentful. Helen was Paul's only hope and support in the city. If Helen said she couldn't do anything, then Paul really wouldn't be able to take the exams this year. No matter how resentful he was, he couldn't deny this fact. Without Michael's help, Paul was nothing. The campus had been cleared for the exams. Paul stood at the school gate with his shabby, worn-out plastic woven bag, his eyes filled with venom and resentment. Passing parents and students gave him a wide berth, avoiding the strange boy. This place was so big, this city so prosperous. Why couldn't there be a place for him? He wasn't asking for a life of luxury, just a small chance. Why couldn't they grant him this one small request? Paul looked longingly at the imposing school gates until a security guard politely asked him to leave. "Hey kid, the school is closing for lockdown now. You should head home. You have the exams tomorrow." This well-intentioned reminder hit a nerve. Paul, like a cat whose tail had been stepped on, bristled and roared at the guard. "So what if it's the exams? Does that make you special? You're just a gatekeeper. What right do you have to look down on me? You're not any better. So what if I can't take the exams this year? I'll be fine next year. I'll definitely make something of myself and shove it in the faces of all you condescending jerks." The guard, bewildered by the sudden verbal assault, was completely thrown off. What did I say wrong? The guard's temper flared, and he shoved Paul out the school gate. Where did this crazy kid come from? Get out of here. Don't get in the way of the other students. The exams are the most important thing in a person's life. Can you afford to be responsible if you cause any delays? In front of the crowd of people coming and going, Paul was unceremoniously kicked out by the guard. Tears welled up in his eyes. The exams were the most important thing in a person's life, but Michael had ruined his exams, ruined everything, ruined his life. And Helen. Paul walked down the street, his face a mask of hatred, clutching the $2,000 Helen had given him for a hotel. The intense resentment and hatred churning inside him had nowhere to go, and he started to hate Helen too. $2,000. In the countryside, that could feed a large family for half a year if they were frugal. But it wasn't even enough to buy a button on one of Helen's dresses. Was she trying to get rid of a beggar? Did he care about the $2,000? What he cared about was the residency and the chance to take the exams here. If she couldn't get him into the exams here, why did she give him hope in the first place? If he had never had hope, he wouldn't have been disappointed. He wouldn't have come to the city, seen all its splendor, only to be denied what he wanted. The stark contrast nearly drove Paul mad. He walked and cried, his young face contorted in pain, looking like a demon crawled out of hell. Paul was filled with so much hate. He hated Michael, he hated Helen. He hated all the condescending people who looked down on him, and he hated this vast, sprawling city that couldn't find a place for one small boy from the countryside. Paul watched the sun dip below the horizon. Tomorrow was the day he had been looking forward to, the turning point of his life, the test he had worked 18 years for, but because of Michael and Helen, he had lost his chance. While Paul wandered the streets aimlessly, Helen tossed and turned in her bed. The exams were tomorrow, but it was already 3 in the morning, and she wasn't the least bit sleepy. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Michael's face, changing from joy to indifference. She saw the notification that he had blocked her, and his empty social media page. Helen had a nagging feeling that she had lost something incredibly important, something she would regret for the rest of her life. Unable to sleep, Helen opened her phone and sent message after message to Michael, only to be met with the red exclamation mark of a failed delivery. The boy who used to have a special notification sound just for her, who would wake up groggy in the middle of the night to reply to her texts, was gone. Helen closed her eyes and hugged herself tightly, curling into a fetal position. Only then did her anxious, restless heart find a sliver of peace. Helen desperately tried to reassure herself. Michael is the kindest person I know. He's never once been angry with me. He must just be angry for now. If I just try my best to appease him, apologize sincerely, he loves me so much. He defied his entire family to be with me. He'll forgive me. Clinging to this fragile hope, Helen finally closed her eyes in the pre-dawn light and drifted into a short, fitful sleep. Helen was still distracted and on edge when she got to the exam hall. She had probably only slept for less than 2 hours the night before. She woke up with a splitting headache, which only subsided after taking a painkiller. She looked like a wilted flower. When she looked in the mirror while getting ready, she saw the huge dark circles under her eyes. Sitting at her desk, Helen felt like she was in a daze. The first exam was language arts, but all the classic poems she had memorized were gone from her mind, replaced by a screen full of red exclamation marks and Michael's words. When the bell rang to signal the end of the exam, Helen barely managed to finish and turned in her paper in a daze. Outside the exam hall, her parents were waiting. They rushed over as soon as they saw her. How did it go? Faced with her parents' eager eyes and questions, Helen guiltily looked away, unable to meet their gaze. Helen knew very well that the hopes of the entire family rested on her shoulders. But after all the recent turmoil, how could she tell her parents that she had been in a terrible state during the exam? Helen felt a lump in her throat, a bitter pill she couldn't swallow or spit out, leaving only a bitter taste that filled her mouth and nose. It was an unbearable feeling. Helen just lowered her head, her voice softer than a mosquito's buzz. It was okay, I guess. I did my usual. The 2 days of exams passed in a flash. After the final English exam, Helen felt like she had just been pulled out of water. Her back was soaked in a cold sweat, and she had to rest her head on the desk for a long time to recover. All around her, students, regardless of how well they did, were celebrating the end of the final exam, flying out of the school gates like birds freed from a cage. But Helen's heart sank like a stone in a bottomless pit. She didn't even need to check the answers to know that she had bombed the exams this time. She hadn't even performed at 1/10 of her usual level. She hadn't finished the last 2 major problems in math, she hadn't completed the science section, and during the English listening comprehension, she had zoned out for a moment and completely lost track, rendering the first half of the test practically useless. Helen dragged her heavy feet towards the school gate, watching countless smiling students pass by. She, however, looked grim, a stark contrast to her surroundings. The parents waiting to pick up their children were a festive sight. Some wore celebratory red dresses, others had custom-made banners, and some had prepared gifts of the latest electronics. At the very least, everyone held a bouquet of flowers, waiting for their little warriors to return victorious from the battlefield. The entire school gate was a scene of joyous chaos, a new beginning for these young people. But when Helen saw her parents in the distance, their expressions were serious, their hands empty. As soon as they saw her, they rushed over to ask, "How did it go? Do you want to check your answers? Let's go home and estimate your score. You'll feel better knowing. Do you still remember your answers?" A nearby parent saw Helen's pale face and couldn't help but speak up for her. "Come on, the kid just finished her exams. Let her relax for a couple of days. The papers are turned in, what's the rush to estimate the score? Look how pale your daughter is." Helen's mother looked annoyed but managed to suppress it, pulling Helen towards the car. Helen was like a puppet, silent and unresponsive, her face ashen and her expression numb. Inappropriately, Helen suddenly thought of Michael. If Michael had taken the exams this year, he definitely would have gotten into Harvard and achieved his dream, right? This year's math section was hard, but math is his strong suit. He would have done brilliantly. Helen snapped back to reality, her eyes instantly clouded with despair. She had forgotten. Michael couldn't take the exams this year, and the one to blame was the poor student she had sponsored for years and personally brought to the city. Helen felt a tear trail down her face. She gently touched her cheek and realized that, at some point, she had started crying. After the exams, Helen immediately used every connection she had to find Michael. His family had blocked all her contact methods, and his phone was still off. Helen was frantic, tossing and turning every night, unable to sleep. When she closed her eyes, all she could see was Michael's smiling face. But Michael had vanished as if he had dissolved into the ocean, disappearing completely from the world. Helen couldn't believe Michael would just abandon her and disappear. They had grown up together. Michael loved her so much. How could he be so cruel as to disappear from her life because of one mistake she made? Helen's loud search for Michael made all their mutual friends aware of the situation. She wanted to use her family's connections to find him, but she didn't dare let her parents know that Michael was angry with her because of the stupid thing she had done. Her entire family now depended on the Canes for their livelihood. Besides, her family was a shadow of its former self. If the Canes were determined to hide Michael, how could her family possibly find him now? Helen had never hated her own powerlessness so much. She grew thinner by the day, losing her former sunny and cheerful disposition, becoming more withdrawn and silent. Meanwhile, after a few days in a hotel, Paul couldn't contain his restlessness any longer and went to Helen's house to find her. He used to write to her frequently from the mountains, so he knew her address. But Paul didn't want to meet her parents in his current state, so he had never visited before. His hidden motives weren't hard to guess. How difficult would it be for Helen's family to accept a son-in-law like him? Paul didn't want her parents to see him in his current unglamorous state. But after hearing bits and pieces of news from some classmates, Paul couldn't sit still any longer. What did they mean Michael was missing and Helen was desperately looking for him? A thick sense of unease churned in Paul's heart. He messaged Helen, but her replies were cold, and she would hang up the phone after just a few words. During their last call, Helen's impatience was palpable. "Paul, don't you have your own life to live? The exams are over. You're an adult now. Are you going to cling to me for the rest of your life?" Paul was in disbelief. Is Helen not going to take responsibility for me anymore? Paul went straight to her house. When Helen's parents opened the door, they saw a rustic-looking boy with a red belt, looking dusty and sweaty, standing nervously at their doorstep. "I'm here to see Helen." Her mother frowned. "Who are you?" Paul was silent for a moment, then said decisively, "Your daughter's boyfriend." His words made Helen's father's face change drastically. "What nonsense are you talking about? How could you be Helen's boyfriend? Everyone knows Helen has a fiancé. Don't just say things like that. I could report you to the police for slander and extortion." Seeing her father blocking the door, and with other neighbors in the exclusive neighborhood, Paul raised his voice and shouted, "Why not? Call Helen out and ask her why I'm not her boyfriend. She didn't say she had a fiancé when she was kissing me in the school woods behind her fiancé's back. Did she? So many students saw us. She took advantage of me, and she has to take responsibility. I'm an innocent man, so what if I'm from the countryside? Your daughter is from the city, but she's a coward too, afraid to admit what she's done. If Helen won't admit I'm her boyfriend, I'll smash my head against your front door." After her family's fall from grace, they had only managed to keep their longtime family home with the Kane family's help. The neighbors were all wealthy and powerful figures in the city. Paul's loud, country-accented shouts had already caused some of them to frown and open their windows to look over. Her mother's face flushed. Since their family's decline, she had always felt that the neighbors looked at them differently. And now, there was a boy who was clearly from the countryside, shouting at their doorstep that he was involved with her daughter. Her mother felt like she was about to have a heart attack. Weren't Helen and Michael's relationship solid? Michael is outstanding in every way, a top catch even among the city's elite. How could Helen possibly fall for this country boy? Her mother looked Paul up and down in disbelief. Tan skin, a slightly hunched back, and looks that were, at best, cute. He had a certain pathetic charm that could easily arouse a woman's protective instincts. His eyes were lively, but the way they darted around just screamed cunning. Her mother had lived half a lifetime and met countless people. She could tell at a glance that this was a smooth-talking pretty boy, determined to climb the social ladder. Her father frowned deeply, his grip on the doorframe loosening. They couldn't let this country boy keep shouting at their door. The family still had a reputation to uphold. Her father finally let go of the doorframe and let Paul in. Paul lifted his chin high and strode into the living room. He couldn't help but wonder, how would Michael act when he walked into this house? Michael had known Helen since they were children, so he would probably be completely at ease here. Now that Michael was gone, and he, Paul, was going to be Helen's boyfriend in the future, why shouldn't he make himself at home? This would be his home too someday. With that thought, Paul plopped down on the soft sofa and brazenly surveyed the room. What a luxurious house. The crystal chandelier hurt his eyes. The jade artifacts on the display cabinet looked so valuable. Paul remembered clearly. Back home, a poor farmer who couldn't make ends meet sold a small jade bottle from his great-grandmother's dowry to a jade dealer and bought a house in the provincial capital. All this jade must be worth a fortune. If it were all sold and converted into cash, would it fill a large room? The more Paul looked, the more envious and resentful he became. Michael was gone, and Helen wasn't uninterested in him. Why couldn't he be the young master of this family? They were so rich. Couldn't they spare a little from between their fingers to give him a decent life? Why were they so heartless, trying to kick him out? He wouldn't have it. Her mother had already rushed upstairs to find Helen, who had been locked in her room for days. Helen, there's a scruffy country boy here who says he's your boyfriend. How is that possible? Weren't you and Michael doing fine? How could a boy like this suddenly appear? Get rid of him immediately. If the Canes find out, you and Michael are finished. They were already against you two being together. If it weren't for your father's desperate plan back then, having you beaten half to death so you could sneak into Michael's room, do you think your engagement would have survived? If you offend Michael, both your marriage and our family will be ruined. Go downstairs right now and handle this. The Canes and Michael must not find out. Helen's heart sank. She should have known. Paul would show up sooner or later. Helen looked at her anxious mother. Knowing she could no longer hide the truth, she had been too afraid to tell her parents. After a long, silent struggle, she clenched her fists so tightly that her nails pierced her palms, and beads of blood trickled down her fingers. The sharp pain couldn't cover the endless agony in her heart. In a daze, Helen finally mustered the courage to speak. Mom, Michael already knows. He's gone. He doesn't want me anymore. Her mother was thunderstruck. Her face paled, and she staggered back a few steps. Helen, what did you just say? Having held it in for so many days, Helen could no longer hide the truth and confessed everything. As she spoke, tears rolled down her cheeks. Her mother then noticed that her beautiful daughter had become so thin that her bones were showing, with huge dark circles under her eyes, looking haggard and worn. So, this country boy is latching onto our family now. Her mother's eyes widened in disbelief after hearing the story. Helen, are you insane? Does he have a single good quality compared to Michael? How could you make such a mistake? Helen stammered, we didn't go all the way, it was just that the moonlight was perfect that night, and Paul's face looked so clear and captivating. His dark, watery eyes were filled with an admiration and devotion she had never seen in Michael's eyes. They had only planned to talk. The exams were approaching, and Paul was very anxious. Being in a new city, the only person he could trust was Helen. But Paul had moved closer and closer, until his lips gently pressed against hers. For some inexplicable reason, Helen didn't push him away. The Cane family was very strict, and Michael was known for being aloof. In all the years she had known him, even after their engagement was a sure thing, she had never so much as touched his finger. This was not only Paul's first kiss, but hers as well. In that moment of entangled lips, many things crossed Helen's mind. She thought of the letters Paul faithfully sent her every month from the deep mountains, filled with an overflowing admiration and gratitude. She thought of Paul's complete reliance and adoration, an expression Michael would never show her in his entire life. Ever since her family's downfall, her already stooped posture in front of Michael had bent even further. Michael was too perfect. He was a snow lotus on a high mountain, a rare find that few in the world could match, let alone a fallen socialite from a disgraced family. Before, when Helen and Michael were just childhood sweethearts, everyone in the city envied Michael for his good taste and luck in securing such a rare gem. But Helen also knew that many more people said the lucky one was her. Was a girl like Helen someone an ordinary person could be with? Not to mention the difference in their personal abilities, even before her family's fall, their influence couldn't compare to the increasingly powerful Cane family. Some people had even privately mocked her. If that girl from the White family had the guts to just marry into the Cane family, since the Canes don't have a daughter, wouldn't the entire Cane empire be hers after the old couple passes away? Ha ha ha, that's putting it crudely. Isn't that just being a gold digger? Helen's not an idiot. After her family's fall, such talk became even more rampant and vicious. They even started calling her the kept woman and pretty boy of young Master Kane. So, it was only in front of Paul, this boy who had no status or background and had to rely on her for everything, that Helen could reclaim her dignity as a young woman. Perhaps that was why she had made one mistake after another, feeding Paul's appetite until it grew so large that it became impossible to handle. And perhaps that was why, driven by a resentment and bitterness so subtle she hadn't even recognized it herself, she had repeatedly tested Michael's limits, until she reached a point of no return. Her Michael, the Michael who had handled all the paperwork for Paul's transfer without a second thought, who never asked for credit, who ignored his family's stern opposition and the rumors at school, choosing to believe only her. But what had she done? She had had an emotional affair with a greedy boy who wasn't even worthy of shining Michael's shoes. She had let him ruin Michael's chances of taking the exams and fulfilling his dream of getting into Harvard. And now he was gone, completely vanished from her life. Helen broke down in tears. "Mom, it's all my fault. Everything that's happening now is all my fault." Paul was now clinging to Helen for dear life. He couldn't take the exams, his residency had been transferred back to his hometown, and even if he could take them next year, it would be back there. With his grades, in one of the most competitive regions, he would barely get into a third-rate college. What kind of future was that? After thinking it over, Paul decided that latching onto Helen's family was his best bet. Her family was down on their luck. A starved camel is still bigger than a horse. No matter what, it was better than going back to the countryside. Helen had a fiancé? If Helen was so deeply in love with Michael, why didn't she reject him when he kissed her? It must mean she had feelings for him too. Paul insisted that Helen had taken his innocence and was now throwing a tantrum in her house. Helen was stunned. Was this the same innocent, kind-hearted Paul who knew nothing of the world, who used to write to her about his beautiful dreams for the future, who had been so obedient and agreeable when he first came to the city? Helen simply couldn't believe it, couldn't face this completely different Paul. Her eyes were filled with unconcealed disappointment. "Paul, what have you become?" Paul froze, then his tears flowed even more freely. "Helen, if you hadn't told me I could come to the city to study, why would an innocent country boy like me travel all this way to find you? Is your family's money just growing on trees? If you weren't interested in me, why did you pick me out of everyone else to come to the city? The old folks say when you help someone, you should see it through to the end. Since you started helping me, why did you just drop me like a hot potato? Life doesn't work that way." Helen was speechless. Her family's money had indeed come like the wind and gone like the wind. Back when her family was at its peak, they had done plenty of charity work. Paul was just the lucky poor student who had managed to get her attention. If her family hadn't fallen, they could have sponsored 100 Pauls, let alone one. But who could have predicted that the mighty would fall and their empire would crumble in an instant? Her mother was furious. "If it weren't for my daughter, you'd still be farming in that godforsaken mountain, probably with kids of your own by now. You wouldn't have had the good fortune to continue your education and take the college exams. Helping you was a kindness, not an obligation. My daughter helped you because she has a good heart, and now you're turning around and blaming her for not doing enough? I finally understand the saying, a small favor creates a friend, a large one creates an enemy. I never knew someone as shameless as you could exist." Paul was relentless. "Michael is gone, and I've given myself to your daughter. What's the big deal if your family gets a new son-in-law? It's not like you can't afford to support one more person. The only difference between me and Michael is—" "Shut up," Helen roared, her eyes turning red at the mention of Michael. "You think you can compare yourself to Michael? Paul, let me tell you, you're not even fit to shine his shoes." Paul was thunderstruck, standing there in a daze, forgetting even to cry and throw a tantrum. In all the time he had known Helen, this was the first time he had seen her so furious, so hysterical. The sight of her was both terrifying and alien to him. How could Helen not like him? Even with a shining gem like Michael in her possession, she had still chosen him. Didn't that prove his appeal to her? Paul came to his senses, and his tears fell even more fiercely. Helen, you like me too. You know you do. Even though you had Michael, you still liked me. Why can't you just be honest with yourself? Helen glared at Paul, her teeth grinding together. The look in her eyes was that of someone staring at an enemy, as if his words had insulted her very body and soul. You want to know the difference between you and Michael? Helen gave a cold smile, her voice filled with malice and mockery. My love for Michael is the respect and deep affection I have for my future husband. For you, it's no different than feeding a stray cat or dog that depends on me. I will spend my whole life loving Michael. His every word is a command to me. I would do anything to make him happy, but I couldn't care less if you live or die. As Paul's face grew paler, Helen's every word was like a sharpened blade, mercilessly cutting into his heart. Paul, do you see now? That's the difference between you and Michael. Paul threatened to ruin Helen and her family's reputation if they didn't let him into their home. No one knew him anyway. He could just stand at the entrance of their gated community and tell everyone who would listen about how Helen had used and abandoned him. Someone who knew her family would eventually hear. Her parents were so angry they got headaches. Their family was already in decline. If what little reputation they had left was further tarnished, they would be completely disgraced. So, after learning of Michael's disappearance, her parents immediately went to the Kane residence. As expected, but still a blow, Michael's father didn't even open the gate, leaving Helen and her family, who had come to beg for forgiveness, outside. Helen fell to her knees with a thud. Mr. Kane, it's all my fault. I'm so sorry, Michael. I was wrong. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to him and being good to him. Inside, Michael's father was pacing back and forth, furious. That wretched girl has already caused Michael so much harm, and she has the nerve to kneel at our door? Is this some kind of emotional blackmail? Who is she trying to pressure? Does she think a few empty apologies will fix everything? The damage she's done to Michael can never be undone. Michael is so young, not even 18, and he had to go through something like this. What a fine daughter her family raised. His wife's face was grim. Let her kneel if she wants to. Michael has already started his new life abroad. He's not coming back for her. No matter what, she's not going to see him. It was a scorching summer day, with temperatures reaching over 100 degrees in the city. Helen knelt there, her face and lips deathly pale, looking like she could collapse from exhaustion at any moment. The summer weather was fickle. The bright sun was suddenly replaced by a torrential downpour. Helen remained stubbornly kneeling at the gate. Michael's father didn't even go to the office, just to see how long this little brat could keep up the act. Her father, bowing and scraping, rang the intercom at the gate. Old friend, for the sake of our many years of friendship, please give Helen another chance. We've all seen how much she cares for Michael all these years. She's still young, she just made a mistake. She'll change, I promise. I'll keep a close eye on her. The intercom crackled to life, and Michael's father's cold voice came through. Still young? My son is younger than your daughter, and he was injured by the shady character your daughter brought home, so badly that he couldn't even take his exams. And you have the nerve to tell me your daughter is young and foolish? Haven't you heard the saying, late affection is cheaper than dirt? Your daughter is foolish, and so are you. There are plenty of good girls who would love to be Michael's friend. My son is so outstanding. Why should he be stuck on your crooked tree of a daughter? The rain poured down. Helen knelt at the gate, her back ramrod straight, swaying precariously. Seeing that Michael's father had hung up without a second thought after his tirade, her father was both furious and desperate. His face felt like it had been torn off and trampled on by Michael's father. He turned and slapped Helen hard across the face. You animal! You disgrace! How did I raise such a shameless thing like you? The force of the slap sent Helen sprawling to the ground, splashing water everywhere and leaving a bloody scrape on her arm. Helen wasn't angry. Tears mixed with the rain and streamed down her face. Her dad was right to hit her. She deserved it. As the three of them played out their drama of repentance, a figure with a red belt ran through the rain and threw himself at the fallen Helen. Helen! Helen! Paul looked at Helen's pale face, tears of anguish streaming down his own. He looked up and shouted at her father. "You're so desperate to cling to the canes that you would hit your own daughter so hard. All for Michael? You're a bunch of social climbing, snobbish lowlifes." In the heavy rain, Paul screamed at her father, pulling Helen into his arms. Though extremely weak, Helen used all her strength to break free from Paul's grasp and staggered back to her original kneeling spot. Paul stared blankly at the motionless, kneeling Helen, who had bitten her lip until it bled. A storm of anger, jealousy, pain, and hatred raged within him, making it almost impossible to breathe. "Helen, you just can't let go of Michael, can you?" "That's right." Helen's voice was firm. "Michael is the most important person in my life, bar none. I cannot and will not accept losing him." Just then, the gate creaked open, revealing Michael's father, his face dark with fury. "You must be that Paul, right?" Paul flinched, then puffed out his chest and said bravely, "Yes, I am Paul." "Good. At least you're not hiding. You've got more guts than this family of pathetic hypocrites." Michael's father gave a sharp, sinister smile. "All right, since you have the nerve to show your face here, let's settle the score for you hiring thugs to intentionally injure my son's hand." As his words fell, Helen's eyes turned red, her gaze as sharp as a knife, fixed on Paul, whose face had turned pale with guilt. "What's going on?" Helen's stare made Paul's face burn. Paul couldn't meet her eyes, nervously looking away. "It has nothing to do with me. Don't you dare slander an innocent person. My family's debt has nothing to do with me. Those people were just debt collectors. Michael was just unlucky to get caught in the middle. Why would I intentionally hire people?" Paul's defense was weak and unconvincing. Not only did seasoned men like Michael's and Helen's fathers see right through it, but even the young Helen sensed something was wrong. "Is that so?" Michael's father snorted. "Did you think that just because you hired some unemployed bums from your hometown, I wouldn't be able to find out who they are? Paul, you are both foolish and ignorant. You severely underestimate the reach of the Kane family." From the day Michael was injured, his father had felt that something was off. Why would a group of unemployed men travel over 1,000 miles to pinpoint Paul, a student in the city? And how did they happen to show up at the gate of a heavily guarded private school at the exact moment the guards were changing shifts and security was lax, and conveniently run into Paul and a group of high school students? Paul's family was in debt, but what was the use of going after a minor with no legal capacity, and trying to sell him off to pay the debt in broad daylight? The school and the police would never allow it. Sure enough, a little digging revealed the truth. Those men weren't there to collect a debt, as Paul had claimed. Paul himself had contacted them and used the money Helen had given him to pay for their travel expenses. Not only that, but Paul had also given them a specific time and a picture of Michael so they would recognize him. That was how the thugs had managed to catch Michael at the school gate at the perfect time and severely injure his right hand. Helen felt as if she had been plunged into an icy abyss. So, from the very beginning, Paul had been putting on an act. Paul had never changed. He had always been this cold and vicious. Helen looked at Paul in disbelief. Under the barrage of questions from Michael's father, Paul was clearly panicking, his body and lips trembling violently. "You're lying. I didn't do it. How could I do something like that? Don't listen to him. He's just trying to get revenge for Michael. So he's making up lies to frame me. It wasn't me. I didn't do it." Michael's father waved his hand dismissively, looking at Paul as if he were an ant he could crush at any moment. "Those men have already been arrested. Whether their testimony is valid will be determined by the police, not by you calling me a liar. Paul, Michael doesn't want to get tangled up with a sewer rat like you. But I do. That's my son, whom I've cherished since the day he was born. I will not tolerate my son being intentionally harmed like this. Absolutely not." Helen was completely stunned. She looked at the boy in front of her, the boy she once thought was as pure and bright as a mountain spring, full of life and optimism. Her gaze was unfocused, as if she had been hit over the head with a sledgehammer. "Why?" Seeing that the jig was up, Paul suddenly broke down and screamed. "I was just resentful. I was so resentful. Why was Michael born into such a rich family, growing up with everything while I was born in a poor mountain village, unable to climb out on my own. Why does Michael have such loving parents, while I was almost drowned in a toilet just for being a boy? They racked up their own debts, and then they wanted to sell me to some old woman for money. Why does Michael have everything, while I have nothing? Paul alternated between sobbing and laughing hysterically, his mind completely unhinged. He pointed a finger at everyone present. He already had everything. Why did he have to fight me for Helen? And Michael knew I had nothing, that Helen was all I had. Why couldn't he just give her to me? He deserved it. I didn't want him to take the exams. What good is a boy who has to repeat a year? How could a boy like that be worthy of Helen? And I was supposed to take the exams in the city this year, to soar to success, and then smoothly marry Helen and become the young master of her family. So, for such an absurd reason, Paul had cruelly ruined Michael's hand and his dream of getting into Harvard. He thought that if Michael couldn't take the exams, Helen would lose interest in him. Michael's father was at a loss for words. His son getting mixed up with a lunatic like this was a complete disaster. And what was even more ridiculous was that this disaster had been brought upon them by his son's own childhood sweetheart and fiancée. Michael's father couldn't be bothered to say any more. He turned and went back inside, slamming the door shut. This ignorant boy, Paul, was audacious and fearless. He had no idea that what he had done was a serious crime. Michael's father didn't even have to lift a finger. The law would take care of Paul. Besides, Paul didn't understand that for a truly exceptional student like Michael, the exams were not the only path to success. Michael was already enrolled in one of the top universities in the United States, probably immersed in the ocean of knowledge, not dwelling on the painful memories of the past. The thud of the closing door was like a blow to Helen's heart, like a slap across the face, mocking her for her poor judgment, for letting a wolf into her house. Helen couldn't hold back any longer. She lunged at Paul and grabbed him by the throat. Why did you do it? Why? Michael never did anything to you. Michael was the one who got you registered here. Without him, you wouldn't have been able to study in the city. You should be grateful, not trying to hurt him. Paul screamed and struggled, rolling around in the muddy rain. Why should I thank him? He's so rich. Isn't it his duty to help me? I just like you. It's Michael's fault for not giving you to me. I did it because I like you so much. What did I do wrong? I'm the only one who truly likes you. Michael disappeared without a word. But I'm still here with you. Doesn't that prove my love for you? Helen's arms fell limply to her sides. She buried her head in her hands and knelt on the ground, sobbing in agony. He was crazy. Paul was truly crazy. Why had she brought this entitled, ungrateful madman to the city, to Michael's side, letting him push the boundaries until he had completely destroyed her and Michael's lives? Helen was filled with a mixture of hatred and anger. After being under the sun all day and then soaked by the heavy rain, her eyes rolled back and she fainted. Far away in the United States, Michael was unaware of the chaos unfolding back home. Even if he had known, he wouldn't have cared. He was an exceptionally talented young man, and even at one of the top universities in the US, he was still among the best. In less than a month, the thick bandages on his hand were removed, replaced by a thin layer of a special white wrap. Fortunately, the blade had not damaged any of the tendons in his right hand. With proper rest, it would fully recover. The official university classes hadn't started yet, but he was assisting a professor in a top-tier laboratory, a sort of head start for the scholarship students. After learning what had happened to the Chinese student, the professor was very accommodating, trying to avoid giving Michael any writing-intensive tasks to protect his right hand. Michael listened to the professor's complex technical terms and couldn't help but smile to himself. See? When you're good, you get a green light everywhere. Only those who have no skills of their own waste their days complaining about their fate. Like Paul back home, who spent his days cursing his bad luck for not being born rich, without ever considering that so many boys from the mountains had made it out on their own and found their place in the big cities. Otherwise, how would the term small-town test-taking machine have become so popular online? And what about that famous female principal who had produced so many top students from the mountains? Paul spent his days blaming everyone and everything but himself, biting the hand that fed him. Paul's failure was inevitable, even if he had taken the exams in the city that year. Michael was sure Paul knew his own limitations. If he was really as hardworking as he claimed, why was he so anxious before the exams? So desperate that he would ruin Michael's hand, and repeatedly urge Helen to ask Mr. Chan to tutor him, and shamelessly demand that Michael give him a study guide? Michael shook his head, pushing these irrelevant people out of his mind. Looking at the clock on the lab wall, Michael felt a momentary daze. It should be about time for the exam scores to be released back home, right? Ever since she fainted that day, Helen had been running a high fever, lying in bed in a daze, losing track of day and night. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind was filled with Michael's father questioning Paul, and Paul's crazed retorts. Why had she been so foolish as to bring Paul to the city in the first place? Her mind was a muddled mess. She couldn't understand why she had done it. Paul had been taken away by the police. He was suspected of hiring someone to intentionally cause harm. Even though he was a minor, he was over 14 and had to bear the legal consequences. Her family despised Paul. When he cried and begged them to save him, no one said a word. They couldn't wait for the police to take him away, not even caring about the negative attention it would bring to their family, just wanting to get rid of the bad omen as quickly as possible. By the day the exam scores were released, Helen's fever still hadn't broken, and she was still asleep in bed. At midnight, only her parents were sitting anxiously in the living room, constantly refreshing the results page. They had a good idea of how Helen would do. To revive their family's fortunes, Helen had always studied hard. Her grades were good, and she had done exceptionally well on the last mock exam. As long as Helen did well, everything would be fine. Her father thought of Michael's father's condescending attitude that rainy day and gritted his teeth. What's there to be so smug about? Once Helen gets into a top university and takes over the family business, we'll make him regret looking down on us. With this eager anticipation, her parents finally refreshed the page and saw the results. But the score, written in black and white, was like a blow to the head. Her father stared at the number in disbelief, reading it 3 times. Quick! Look! Am I seeing things? Is there a mistake in the system? Her mother was equally shocked. They both punched the numbers into a calculator for a long time, but the result was the same. Helen had really only scored that low. Her father's hands were trembling. He tried to light a cigarette, but his hands shook so much that he couldn't get it lit.
Impossible, impossible.
There must be a mistake. It has to be a grading error. We'll appeal and have her papers reviewed. This is absolutely impossible. With this score based on previous year's standards, she would barely get into a decent state university. But Helen was supposed to be a top university candidate. Her mother's fingers also trembled as she typed, preparing to use what little connections they had left to look into Helen's scores. Unnoticed by them, the door to the upstairs bedroom creaked open. Helen stood there, her face pale. The prolonged fever had brought a morbid flush to her cheeks. Already thin from Michael's disappearance, she was now emaciated from her illness, her cheekbones protruding sharply, completely devoid of her former campus goddess charm. No need to review them. Helen's hoarse voice came from upstairs, startling her parents. Then her father exploded in anger. Of course we'll review them. How could this be your score? There must be something wrong. Helen's voice was low, but clear enough for both of them to hear, filled with a mix of resolve and despair. Really, there's no need. I know. She had been in such a terrible state during the exams. A score like this was to be expected. So why put her parents through the trouble of trying to get her scores reviewed? If they did, the result would only be more humiliating. Her mother could no longer hold herself together and collapsed onto the sofa like a deflated balloon, her eyes completely lifeless. It was all over. The White family's last hope of a comeback was gone. If Helen couldn't get into a top university, what future did their family have? Helen didn't care about the gloom in the living room. This was what she deserved. Michael couldn't take the exams because of her, so it was only right that she scored so poorly. Dad, Mom, next year. I'll retake the year next year. After a long, long silence, Helen finally mustered the courage to speak again. She felt as if her vocal cords were glued together, and it took all her strength to tear them apart to speak. After the weak words left her lips, her throat was raw and bloody. Her heart felt like it had been shattered into a million pieces, then ground into dust and thrown into a bottomless abyss, into a bone-chilling cold. Once Helen was a little more clear-headed. She opened the time capsule she and Michael had made back in their freshman year. She had kept Michael's. Helen opened it and saw the yellowed paper, on which was written a young boy's passionate and innocent feelings. I like Helen. After the exams, I have to confess to her. In that instant, Helen stumbled to her knees, clutching her chest, the pain in her heart so intense she could barely breathe. After this year's exams, the Michael from 3 years ago was going to confess to her. But before the exams, because of her own foolishness, she had already lost the boy who loved her so deeply that he was willing to stand against the world for her. This was her punishment. 2 years passed in the blink of an eye. Michael's parents, worried that he would be reminded of the past if he returned home, didn't let him come back. They were also afraid that the desperate Helen and her family would try to bother him again. So every year during his break, they would fly to the United States to see him. Seeing Michael thriving in the US, the wound on his right hand completely healed, and with some blonde American girls pursuing him, his mother was finally at ease. Standing on the sprawling campus, she watched the athletic basketball captain trying to show off for Michael, while her own son, oblivious, was engrossed in a book. She smiled softly. This is the life Michael should be living. His mother snapped back to reality and patted Michael's head. The college exam results were just released back home. Michael was unconcerned. I know, but we don't have any other cousins taking the exams. Do we? Why are you still paying attention to that, Mom? Helen retook the year. His mother hesitated for a moment, then decided to tell him everything. She felt that Michael was now strong enough not to be affected by anything related to Helen. As expected, Michael just closed his book, his expression still calm. I figured. He had torn down the facade between them before the exams and had also canceled Paul's residency. He had known Helen for so many years, of course. He knew she didn't have a strong mental fortitude. Going into the exams with that kind of blow and mindset, it would have been a miracle if she had done well. Michael had done it on purpose and he didn't try to hide it. Why should Paul be allowed to recklessly ruin his hand and his exams, while he couldn't retaliate against the one who caused it all? Helen had betrayed him, betrayed their love. This was the punishment she deserved. She wanted him to retake a year, then he would make sure Paul could never take the exams again, and that Helen would have to retake the year with him. Helen didn't do very well this year either, his mother said in a low voice. Her family isn't planning on letting her continue her studies, because her family could no longer afford it. After Michael went abroad, all ties between the Kane and White families were severed. Without the Kane's support, the White family was nothing. They couldn't keep their last remaining mansion and had moved into a small, dark apartment. Her parents spent their days either fighting or cursing Helen for being so stupid as to sponsor some poor boy from the countryside and getting on Michael's bad side. In such an environment, how could Helen, who was already under immense pressure from retaking the year, possibly do well? Her score was even worse than the first time, and she had to settle for a random, mediocre school. Michael just smiled indifferently at the news. They were people from his past. Why should he waste any more mental energy on them? Were they even worth it? What about Paul? Is he still in prison? His mother nodded. It was a very serious offense. The sentence was harsh even for a minor. But I heard his mental state isn't very good. He's constantly screaming and throwing tantrums in prison, claiming he's the future young master of the White family, asking people if they know who the Whites are, and calling others country bumpkins and hicks. His mother suppressed her disgust, refraining from repeating the vile things Paul had said about Michael. Michael just shook his head dismissively. That's his life now. By the way, Mom, my assets generate income every year. I want to use a portion of that income to set up a foundation to sponsor poor boys from the mountains to go to school. His mother was surprised. They say once bitten, twice shy. Michael had been hurt by a poor boy Helen had sponsored. Why would he want to sponsor them now? Michael just felt it was a shame. He never believed that a boy born in the mountains should be destined to spend his life in the mud. The unequal distribution of social resources was not something a young man under 20 could solve. But Michael wanted to do something. Among his classmates in the US, there was a Chinese-American boy who also came from a rural background. He was a student of that great female principal, and he had come to the US on a full scholarship. Michael was deeply moved. A flower that grows in the mud has a much harder time blooming than one that is pampered in a greenhouse. He couldn't save the world, but he could make it a little easier for these budding flowers to bloom. Paul was just an extreme outlier, crooked from the start. How could he judge all the boys from the mountains because of him, and deny them the opportunities they might have had? Michael nodded firmly. Mom, I've really thought this through. I'll name the foundation the Azure Cloud Foundation, dedicated to sponsoring poor boys from the mountains to get an education. When you go back, please have Dad start putting a team together. Michael looked up at the clear, azure sky. The Azure Cloud Foundation. A good wind to lift them up. For years later, Michael graduated from college and returned to take over the Kane Group. He had spent those 4 years to the fullest, even starting a few small ventures abroad, all of which turned out to be quite successful. Michael hadn't planned on returning to run the company so soon, but his father had made a big show of arranging things for him. If you start at the company early, you won't have so much pressure at the beginning. By the time I'm old, the entire Kane Group will be in your hands, and I can retire with peace of mind. Looking at his father's graying temples, Michael's heart ached. He had been studying abroad for 4 years and hadn't taken good care of his parents. They must have missed him a lot back home, and they must have been tired. Otherwise, how had his dad's hair turned gray without him noticing? Out of Michael's sight, his mother rolled her eyes. It's normal for hair to turn gray after 40. Her husband had just stopped dyeing his hair a few weeks before their son came home, all in a bid to retire early and spend his days walking his bird and looking at the sea, trying to guilt-trip their son. But she didn't expose him. Michael had been in the US for 4 years, with a 13-hour time difference. It was inconvenient to travel back and forth, and she missed her son every day. Now that her son was back and working at the company, she would be able to see him often, right? Even if he lived in an apartment near the office on weekdays, he would still come home to see his dear old mom on weekends, wouldn't he? Humming a tune, his mother went into the kitchen, took the knife from the housekeeper, and started preparing a welcome home feast for Michael herself. The family had a joyful meal together. After resting for 2 days, Michael went straight to the Kane Group. The company was buzzing with the news that the old chairman's only son had returned from his studies in the US and was preparing to take over the company. The young Mr. Kane is so handsome. Even as a guy, I can't look him in the eye. One look and my heart starts pounding. Handsome is the least of his qualities. I heard he was a brilliant student, a natural-born scholar. You can't compare him to other people's kids. It's so depressing. Was he the top scorer in the city's college exams that year? I don't think so. I heard somewhere that he missed the exams that year because of an accident. Does anyone know what happened? I think it had something to do with his ex-fiancée. I heard she was a terrible person and caused him to miss the exams. That's so awful. Women are the worst. The break room was abuzz with discussions about Michael's recent appearances. The Kane Group had a great corporate culture and a good work environment, so everyone was supportive of the very capable young Mr. Kane. When they heard that such an outstanding young man had had a major life event ruined by a woman, a few of the younger men were furious and started badmouthing the unknown ex-fiancée in the break room. In a corner of the break room, a familiar yet strange figure was hunched over. If Michael had been there, he might not have recognized her. It was Helen, whom he hadn't seen in 4 years. After retaking a year, Helen was now a senior in college, doing an internship. Against her protests, her family had pushed her into an internship at the Kane Group. As long as you can get into the Kane Group, you can definitely win Michael back. Then our family will be saved. Helen was in agony. The Kane Group was a corporate giant in the city. Even getting an internship there was not easy. The place was filled with graduates from top universities. Helen, from a mediocre state school, had no chance. In the end, her father had to swallow his pride and pull some strings to get her in. And now, Helen was in the break room, listening to the employees praise the brilliant young Mr. Kane and curse his ex-fiancée. Helen gripped her mug tightly. The scalding water spilled out, but she was oblivious to the searing pain. She regretted it so much. She really, truly regretted it. If she hadn't been so foolish back then, Helen was lost in a fantasy again. Then, after graduation, she and Michael would have gotten married right away. Her family wouldn't be in such a dire state, and she would have a place at the Kane Group, instead of being just an intern who fetched coffee and ran errands. Helen? Helen? What's wrong? The hot water spilled on your hand. Go rinse it. A colleague finally noticed her red hands and anxiously pulled her towards the restroom to run them under cold water. Another colleague went with her, but when she looked up, she froze in surprise. Helen, why are you crying? Helen didn't know how to face Michael. Her parents, hearing that Michael had officially joined the Kane Group, pestered her every day to accidentally run into him. Helen didn't want to. She even wished she would never see him again for the rest of her life. The Kane Group's building was so big, and he was always working on the executive floors in the strategy department. How could she possibly run into him? But she never expected to see him in the company's downstairs coffee shop. Michael squinted, his eyes landing on the young woman by the window who looked so different from the one in his memories. He felt a moment of dazed uncertainty. For years without seeing her, and she looks like this? I almost didn't recognize her. And what is she doing in the Kane Group's internal coffee shop? Michael narrowed his eyes, surprised that he felt nothing. They were strangers now. Why should there be any connection between them? Helen saw Michael too, and her body involuntarily pressed back against the sofa, as if seeking support, as if she wouldn't have the strength to face this chance encounter otherwise. Michael was different from 4 years ago. He was sharper, more like a honed blade, handsome and formidable. He chatted and laughed effortlessly with a group of company executives whom Helen wasn't even qualified to meet. Even among a group of powerful, middle-aged women, Michael was the center of attention, glowing with a subtle light. The moment their eyes met, Helen's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and trepidation, but also an irrepressible hope. What will he do? Will he come over and talk to me? Or will he slap me across the face, taking revenge for the past that caused him so much pain? Helen didn't know what he would do. Her back was soaked in a cold sweat, and she was trembling slightly. How am I supposed to face him? Will he agree to get back together with me? But to her surprise, all Michael gave her was a single unreadable glance. Then, as if he had seen a wisp of air, he walked past her table without a second look. Helen was frozen in place, feeling as if her soul had been torn from her body by his cold indifference. She would have preferred it if Michael had made a scene, yelled at her in front of everyone in the coffee shop, because only love breeds hate. If Michael resented her, cursed her, it would mean he still cared. This could only mean that he no longer cared about her at all. After that encounter, Helen was on edge, worried that Michael would have her fired. But a secret part of her hoped he would. If he fired her, it would mean she still occupied a place in his heart. But nothing happened. Everything was calm. Michael was still the high and mighty young Mr. Kane, and Helen was just a lowly intern, a million miles beneath him. She never saw him again. As her college graduation approached, Helen bowed and scraped, trying to secure a full-time position at the Kane Group. But her direct supervisor looked troubled. Helen, it's not that I'm trying to make things difficult for you, but your academic background is a real weakness, and her work performance wasn't so outstanding that they couldn't live without her. Helen felt as if she had been plunged into an icy abyss. Her job search had been a series of rejections because of her qualifications. The Kane Group was her last hope. Helen sat dejectedly in the break room, worrying about her future, when she heard the employees gossiping again. The board meeting just ended. Young Mr. Kane has officially been appointed to the board of directors, with a unanimous vote. In the past year, he's accomplished so much at such a young age. Our bonuses have even doubled. His appointment to the board was a sure thing, no surprise at all. Well, I guess we can drop the young now. We'll have to call him Mr. Kane. Helen's face was ashen. She buried her head in her hands. After work, Helen trudged out of the company building, just in time to see Michael's Maybach speed away. Standing at the entrance was someone she never expected to see. It was Paul, who had been in prison for 4 years. When Paul saw Helen, he gave a dazed, silly grin that seemed somewhat sinister. "Helen, did you miss me?" Helen's heart lurched, and her face changed drastically. "Paul, what are you doing here?" Paul came over, grinning, and tugged at her sleeve. "Helen, I'm your boyfriend. Why wouldn't I come looking for you? I'm out of prison now. We're gonna get married and live together. We're gonna have a good life." Helen struggled desperately. "Paul, you're crazy. Get away from me. Let me go." As Michael's Maybach sped away, he had actually seen the crazed Paul in his rearview mirror. At his current status, he had neither the interest nor the time to get involved in such low-class drama from his past. These people were not worthy of the young Mr. Kane's time, not when his mind was occupied with billion-dollar deals. And Michael wasn't worried that Helen would have it too easy. With a crazy, obsessive person like Paul clinging to her, what kind of future could she possibly have? On the distant horizon, the sun slowly set, the evening glow like a spilled bowl of golden pumpkin soup. The summer wind was dry and warm, blowing through Michael's hair. Michael felt a sense of ease he had never known before. The past was gone, but the future was bright. From now on, his path was a wide, open road.